Hey, so we've been updating this regularly. By the way, I will say that one source that we've been using, which is very helpful, is the Immigration Legal Resource Center, or ILRC. They do updates every 2 weeks at the same time, and I believe you can sign up to be part of that. They don't do question and answer because there's so many people on it, but it is, up to date information. And I will say that it's also, they try and both tell you, the bad, the good, but also, what's inspiring about it at all is just how hard ILRC and how hard so many attorneys and advocates out there are fighting right now, and that gives us all, hope going forward for sure. So here's what we have to say. Responding in this current environment, you got to do some things to prepare yourself, prepare your business. Also think about what your rights are when you might encounter ICE. By the way, there's a good app before I get started that you should probably check into. It's called Ice Block. You can get it from the App Store. And what it does is it's just basically a community vigilance or notice kind of situation, so that if you see ICE activity, you put it on the Ice Block and app, and it tells people everywhere, where it's going on, so that people can avoid that area or prepare and other things. So very helpful tools that are starting to go out there. Okay, well, so just have to say that of course, always, this is not legal advice. This is general information. But if you want some legal advice, go to that website that I gave you so that you can sign up for individual services, because we'd be glad to give you some advice. Okay, so the first thing I would say, for what it's worth, is that California is supposed to be, by law, protecting immigrants generally. There's this thing called the California Values Act that aims to limit the assistance and availability of information to ICE. It says that immigrants are valuable and essential members of the California community. Oh, yes, for sure. There's also California's transparent review of unjust transfers and holds that takes into account, police might put a hold on you to wait for ICE to get there, something that is prevented in California. And then there's a profiling act also that actually a federal court, probably used in a ruling that we're not sure is being followed at this point, but basically banning racial profiling and picking people up. And, for example, the thing that just recently happened with the Home Depot down in LA, I mean, the idea was, no particular specific person they were going for or specific people. They just showed up in a Home Depot parking lot without any kind of, reasonable suspicion of somebody who was violating the immigration laws or things like that. And so court at this point is considering whether the Trump administration and ICE have ignored this important federal court ruling, which at least in the democracy we know, the executive has to follow what the courts say. So all right, so what I'm saying is, despite these good things in California, that's there, and of course the service community that is behind immigrants and trying to fight this tooth and nail, it's still important for folks who might affect it to do some preparation and knowing their rights going forward. Okay, so let's talk about what these rights are. So the agenda today is certainly want to do a quick know your rights recap so that you know what's going on. Second is, some questions that we might raise, to help you prepare, help you think about if you or somebody could be potentially detained or deported. Certainly some resources. Oh, shoot. Certainly some resources that are out there that are helpful for folks. Things like detainee search engine for the web, things like that. So those things are all helpful resources that we want to turn you on to. And then finally, if you are thinking, if you have a business, you think you need to prepare for detention or deportation, we are also giving you some options for that business, keeping it, selling it, closing it. We want to make sure that you know what you need to do to take care of all of those potential options. Okay. All right, well, let's start with knowing your rights. All right, so what the first thing we're talking about here is that there has been a national registry put out there. It's basically a website that the federal government has now set up that says, hey, undocumented people, you need to register. Okay. Well, the Supreme Court has not passed on this yet. There are definitely concerns about it, about self-incrimination, that everybody has the Fifth Amendment right not to, incriminate themselves. So what we say is don't do anything with this register until the Supreme Court has passed on it, just because, there's really no benefit in reporting. It's only going to be used for people, to come and basically detain you and deport you if they, when they get around to it. Okay. So there is a lawsuit that's, been filed to stop this. But until then, basically don't do it is what we say. That's not saying breaking law. We can't say don't break the law. What we're saying is the Supreme Court has not passed upon this yet, and we think that there's a problem with the self-incrimination constitutional protections, requiring people to give up their identities, that may subject them to this process. So I think the best decision maker about whether this law is correct or not would be the Supreme Court. Okay, so, but here's some bad news for you. That is that you may have already reported, meaning you may have given up your information to sources that can be accessed by ICE, a tax ID number. When we first saw this coming out, we were saying this is a total violation of trust from I want to say this was 1996 or was it 76? Anyway, so at that time there was in the federal government an understanding that people need to file taxes even if they don't have a social security number. And so the pact that was made at that time was, okay, you come forward, pay your taxes, use this tax ID number that is not a social security number, but we will give you this tax ID number. We will never use it to contact you other than about your taxes. Well, now the current word is that it's being used for the wording I remember was people already slated for detention and deportation, meaning already on the radar screen for detention. And you might think that everybody who's undocumented is on that screen, but what I'm saying to you is that the priority population to be deported and detained is getting cooperation from the IRS to give up that information. The problem is, if you have an ITIN, you're supposed to be updating it too. So there's a way that they could potentially get you if you do have a different address and you didn't update it going forward. So these are things, of course, to talk to an immigration attorney about, if you haven't been approached or anything like that, just to make sure you sort of know what the landscape is out there. DACA is another. If you've signed up for DACA, then they already have your information, and you're supposed to be updating it, as to your whereabouts on a regular basis. DACA is probably going down, unfortunately, terribly, tragically. But it does mean that again, they are violating a pact with you that you came forward, said you were undocumented, you were born here in the US. DACA should have protected you and continue to protect you. Right now, that information, I mean, my understanding is it's still overseen by the courts, what the Trump administration can do with DACA. But it is something that is in, basically the registration, the information systems that ICE can get to. If you got a Form I-94, that's an arrival departure record when you come over the border. That also puts your information into the system. A green card, a legal permanent residence certificate, any of these things already. And if you are in process, like for a permanent residence or something like that, your information is already in the system as well. So that's really some bad news. I don't mean to scare you. I'm just saying, that if the courts aren't, if they fail us at this point, what they're going to fail us with is basically not, understanding that this information was voluntarily given to the US with an understanding that it wouldn't be used against people. And that's what hopefully courts will pay attention to. Yep. All right, there was one other kind of reporting thing that we were all worried about for a while. It was called the Corporate Transparency Act, or it was called the Beneficial Ownership Registration Process. You should know that that is no longer a concern. You can register for it if you want, if it's still out there for registration. But the Treasury Department has stated, as recently as March, that it's not going to go after anybody or penalize anybody for failure to register their beneficial ownership information or their, under the Corporate Transparency Act is what it's called. And it's usually that you would register through something called FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Network Center. But again, no reason to do that. No one will be penalized if you don't report there. Well, originally LLC owners and corporation owners had to do that. No more. You don't have to. I mean, you won't be penalized. Okay. All right. So here's a little bit more ILRC update. Yeah, well, that's what we said. The registry, the challenge is Fifth Amendment rights. Here's another one. Donald Trump or others seem to be able to say, well, I can take away your legal permanent residences anytime I want to, or it can be revoked if I deem you to be, if Rubio deems you to be a threat. No, only a judge can take that away. ICE may try to trick you, though, in waiving your status by filing this form called an I-407. Never sign that form unless you are checking with an immigration attorney. It's essentially saying, I'm giving up all my rights and, I'm ready to be deported. So don't do that. Okay. Now, we have seen instances of immigrants and certainly some citizens too being detained at the border when trying to enter the US. Okay, for those who are undocumented or in some status, maybe applied for permanent residency, something like that. It is recommended that you not leave the US unless you can deal with the possibility of not being able to return. Okay. Legal permanent residents, people and citizens can be detained, but they always have to be let back in. Okay. But if you aren't in that status there, then, again, think about whether leaving the US might mean that you can't come back. Right? Keep a copy of your immigration papers with you at all times. Make sure they're the valid kind. Lock your phone at the border, deactivate your fingerprint or facial recognition sign-in option because they can look on your phone and see things like you have ICE block on your phone that could potentially trigger something in a further investigation. And then, of course, be mindful what you have on social media. Oh, yes, this sounds like a authoritarian state. Well, as to this, your social media is subject to discretion of ICE officials saying somehow that that makes you more threatening if you said, let's defeat Trump at the next election. That could be seen as threatening. Right. Now, if you encounter law enforcement and they ask you about your immigration status, first, unfortunately, it's always you have to say, don't run, be calm, don't lie, don't show them a false ID, something like that. Now, here's the thing. You should ask if this is an ICE agent or if there's a police officer. Okay. Their authority to search you is different. Okay. You always have the right to remain silent. If you're not a US citizen and an immigration agent requests your papers, then you do have to show them if they are with you. If an immigration agent asks you to search you, you have the right to say no. Agents generally do not have the ability to search you or your belongings without your consent or without probable cause, meaning they have a good reason to believe that you've broken law, not racial profiling. Now, police officers are a little different. They can use what's called reasonable suspicion. If they think you're in the area where a crime was committed, yes, they can stop you, frisk you, things like that. ICE agents can't do that without a higher level of suspicion. Okay. If you are detained by ICE or Border Patrol or by police, here you go. You have the right to hire a lawyer, but they don't have to provide one for you. Okay, be sure to keep a number of an immigration attorney with you at all times. You have the right to call a lawyer or your family. You have the right to be visited by a lawyer in detention. You have the right to have your attorney with you when any hearing happens before an immigration judge. If you are refused to call to an attorney, which many have been, by international law, you have the right to contact the consulate of your country of origin. So make sure you keep that phone number and they can actually contact your family then. Okay. But if it's a police officer that has detained you, then okay, you have the right to a government appointed lawyer in that situation. You should definitely ask for one immediately. If arrested, you have the right to a private phone call within a reasonable time of your arrest. Police may not listen in if the call is made to a lawyer. All right. So, what about home? What if they show up at your home? Okay. You do not have to let police or immigration agents into your home unless they have a warrant that is signed by a judge. Okay. Just an immigration department warrant. It says warrant. It doesn't have a judge's signature on it. I'm going to show you one in just a second. That you do not have to respond to. You absolutely do not. You ask if, if they're still on the other side of the door and they haven't kicked it in. If they are immigration agents, you ask them and you say, what are you there for? Show your badge through the peephole. If they have a warrant that they say is signed by a judge, ask them to slip it under the door. If it's not in the language you can understand, you have the right to slip it back and say, I need it translated. I need a Spanish version of this or something. The idea is do not open your door unless it is a judicial warrant naming a person in your residence or areas of your house to be searched, okay, at that address, okay? If they don't produce a judicial warrant, keep the door closed, say, I do not consent, because that's one of the main things that ICE relies upon. They say, well, we just want to come in and talk to you for a few minutes. Or, ma'am, we're worried about something in the neighborhood and we just wanted to protect you or something, misleading like that. Yeah, the problem is if you open the door, they can do almost anything when they come in. Yes. Now, if agents force their way in, don't resist, but say you want to speak with a lawyer as soon as possible. Okay. Now, here's an important point. If you have a business or if you're at your workplace and ICE shows up there, okay, again, everybody should remain calm. ICE agents can go in the public areas of the business. So if it's in a restaurant, yes, they can go into the dining room of the residents. What I want you to do, if you are a business owner, is tomorrow, before you go in, go to a Home Depot, or not a Home Depot, well, Home Depot could probably have it, Office Depot, something like that. Get a sign that says private, okay? Or you could even, put it up yourself. I suppose you can make your own sign. Put it up on any door that you don't want ICE to go in. Again, public areas they can go in. Anything marked private, they are supposed to not be able to go in there. Okay, it's only if they have it's only if they have that judicial warrant or if you consent. Don't consent, is the idea. Okay. Or I suppose what we're telling you, just to be clear, is we're telling you you have the full right to consent, is what I should probably more carefully say. All right. When ICE shows you an administrative warrant with an employee's name on it, again, not a judicial warrant, okay? You do not have to even say if that employee is working on that day. You do not have to call them or bring the employee in, even if he's at work at the time or she's at work at the time. Only if they have a judicial warrant, that's when you have to basically have the person come out, okay? ICE agents sometimes will ask you things like, hey, there's a lot of people here. Can you tell us which people are undocumented or not? Don't, cooperate with that. Okay. And then, of course, if you can, record the interaction with ICE. In fact, if this happens at your home, you want to have somebody taking video too. Okay. Because there is a growing understanding of what's happening in the public, and this can help, people really realize what is going on in the country. Yeah. All right. Warrants. Let's say a few things about warrants. As we said, judicial warrants are signed by a judge. They do require compliance, okay? ICE warrants, yeah, they don't give the ICE officer the authority to require you to do anything. They don't authorize access to non-public areas. Again, should not physically try to stop an ICE officer from doing their job or from taking action. But again, ask for an attorney if they force things. Judicial warrants, okay, usually will authorize the search or seizure of property or a person, okay? In that situation, you generally have to comply, okay? And a warrant, a judicial warrant, see on the left here, United States District Court, judge's signature, that's what that's going to look like. On the right will be a warrant for an arrest of somebody, Department of Homeland Security. That is not a judicial warrant. That is not giving them the authority to basically do anything. Okay. All right, now a few things you do have to think about at this point. Unfortunately, there are some people who are trying to take advantage of this situation with scamming people who are in distress and are looking for, straight information. So first, make sure you go to a legitimate legal aid organization or a clinic, like for example, the immigration clinic at San Joaquin College of Law or UC Davis or Civic or Central Valley Immigration Integration Collaborative. These are all places that have licensed immigration attorneys that can help you. Okay. You don't want to go to something called a notario or somebody who's a immigration advisor or something like that. Immigration consultants, notaries, paralegals, none of these people can give you an authoritative sense of what the law is and what you're supposed to do. Okay. They may try and charge you for it, even if they have no ability to give you that information. So, all right, keep your original documents in a safe place. Don't give them to anyone unless there's proof that the government requires the original document. For example, permanent status applications, I believe, usually require an original. But you got to know that if you give it to somebody, they might lose it. They might refuse to give it back to you. If you gave it to somebody who wasn't an immigration attorney, they might hold it and say, you need to give me money before I give it back to you. Yeah, so watch that. Okay. Generally, you don't want to give money or personal information to anyone who calls you, texts you, emails you, saying there's a problem with your immigration matter. Okay. No federal agency, no state agency, not even the border control people will ask for your personal information or payment over the phone, okay, or by email or text. Okay? All right, so preparing for detention or deportation, here are some questions that we think you probably want to think about going forward, all right? First of all, access to your bank account is probably, one of the most important things you can think of in addition to, access to your family or contacting people. So make sure that your bank account is something that you can access when you're outside of the US. Okay, we're also suggesting that if you are in detention, you may not even be able to get instructions to your bank. So in a minute, we're going to talk about power of attorney, giving you the ability to give someone else the ability to access your funds on your behalf when necessary. Okay. Here are some other things. If you are leaving, if you're facing deportation, are there family members who rely on your business for income? That could have a reason, that could be a reason to, keep it going, making sure that there's somebody to run the business while you are away. Again, access to money while you're in another country is probably going to be pretty important. You may need to have some cash available for legal fees, for somebody to help spring you from detention or fight your deportation hearing. So you might want to have a little bit of a fund if you can put that aside for something like this. Now, there are organizations in Mexico, Guatemala, other places that do have some on the ground support. It does suggest that, for example, if you go to Mexico, that they are going to ask for some kind of ID or a passport. So of course, want to keep those documents with you if you can. Okay. Here's some resources we were talking about, legal assistance. Again, check out if somebody says they're an immigration lawyer, well, if you want to check them, go to the Cal Bar website here, the bar of the California Bar, excuse me, State Bar. You can look them up, see if they are a licensed and good standing attorney. That would be one way of doing it. There's a list of legal service providers from the Executive Office of Immigration Review. You can check that as another legitimate place. California courts do have some self-help centers that can give you some information to help you. And then legal assistance, lawyer referral services, all of these are potential places that can help you find a real immigration licensed attorney. So just make sure that you're getting that legal assistance from the right source. Now, here's that ICE detainee locator I was talking about. Right, can help determine if a family member has been detained and where they are being held. Okay, it's generally only for people who've been already detained. Helpful to know that person's date of birth. Also, if they have an alien registration number, I don't know if they might have one, but that's also helps to find them. Okay. All right, so options for your business. At this point, I might think about, since we've had a lot of heavy stuff, I'd be happy to take, a 5-minute break real quick for people to just, catch a drink, something like that. And then we can go on with, there's probably another 19 slides for options for your business. So Luis, is it okay if we take a 5-minute break?
Totally. Yeah.
Okay. Right now it's, what is it right now?
608.
6:08. Okay, why don't we come back at 6:10? All right. Let's finish on up here. Now, this is the section where we're talking about, how do you think about your business going forward here? So we're going to give you, basically the three options, keeping the business, selling the business, or closing the business. And each of these has some distinctive steps to it. But let's get started. And again, put questions you might have in the chat, okay? Now, one thing we put in here, I think you could sort of take or leave this, but it is easier to hand off a business either in a sale or, having somebody else take control of it while you're away or something like that, if you have an entity. And what I mean is like a limited liability company or a corporation. The basic idea is that this makes your entity separate from you, right? And it also gives you, by the way, this limited liability protection so that nobody can directly sue you for obligations of the business. And so it does have that benefit. Now, full disclosure, it does cost a little bit. It does mean that every year, starting the second year, if you're a corporation, or starting the first year, if you're an LLC, you're paying this franchise tax, the minimum franchise tax that the California Franchise Tax Board charges for this limited liability shield. That is true, and you have to pay it whether you make any money at all or not. So many people, say that this is too much, and then they want to do a sole proprietorship or a partnership. Those are the kinds of entities, sole proprietor for individuals or married couples, partnerships for just groups of people who aren't related to each other. But neither of those entities have this limited liability shield. So what we're saying to you is not only is it a little harder to sell one of these entities, it does mean also that you don't have that limited liability protection, so you probably shouldn't want to get a whole bunch of insurance, liability insurance, because that's going to be your first and only protection going forward. Okay. Now, if you form one of these entities, you can do it at the State Secretary of State's BizFile online portal. Yep, it's right here, and it's $70 to create a limited liability company, $100 to create a for-profit corporation. If you want to do a nonprofit, that's $30. Yeah, so it's really easy to form one of these, and we're really happy to help you do that through NBCLC. So go ahead and contact us if you're trying to form one of these entities there. Okay. As I said, the reason we do this is so that the business has a sort of a separate life. So they could be, you could have somebody else run it. You could sell it really easily. And then, of course, it can be closed going forward. So, again, something we recommend at the beginning if you don't have one already. Mm. Now, here's the thing we were talking about, the power of attorney. Okay. The basic idea is you can set one of these things up. By the way, you can set this up for a number of different purposes. Medical, you want somebody to be able to make decisions for you if you can't make them. Um, for a business, this is probably more often, somebody who can get to your bank account. Bank is going to need a power of attorney to be able to interact with anybody else than yourself, the account holder, giving you money or, checking balances or stuff like that. Okay. Now, you don't actually need a lawyer to do this. We can send you the form. If anybody needs one of these forms, go ahead and put your name and address in the chat. We can give you a power of attorney form that you can then put it in the hands of a trusted and capable person that you identify. That person becomes your agent, who then is authorized to make decisions on your behalf. It's usually better if you're undocumented to have somebody who is documented or has legal permanent residence, just so that, if they get picked up in the same, you know, um, house raid or something like that, then you'll still have somebody who can make those decisions. Okay. So again, that person who has the power of attorney that you give over to them in this signed document, um, then can make decisions on your behalf as your agent. And you are what's called the principal, the person who then, is the one who controls the agent, right? And the agent can do things like negotiating contracts, managing your bank account, paying your bills, filing legal documents, overseeing the business, all of those things they could do. Okay. So again, we can send you a limited power of attorney. Okay. By the way, we suggest a limited power of attorney because it's only for a specified period or for, in certain circumstances. So for example, it would be if you were detained, maybe then it would expire immediately when you were, you know, paroled or let out. Okay. So the wording would be something like, in the event of my detention, the agent has specific authority to do, these things for a certain period of time or until I am released. Okay. Um, as I said, better to have somebody who has legal status. It has to have the date that you executed it. It has to be signed by you, and it has to be acknowledged before a notary public or signed in the presence of at least two witnesses who also sign. Okay. You want to store it safely. Make sure there's a copy for your employees if you are an owner of a business. You can also file a copy with the county clerk if it involves real estate, because they oversee all the real estate filings and transactions. And then, of course, make sure that if your bank has its own form, that you use that form going forward. But most of the time, these limited powers of attorney will work with a bank or anybody. Okay. All right. It looks a little bit like this. As we said, this is a form that you can, by the way, you can get this form easily on the web. It's compliant with California Probate Code Section 4401. But we can send you a copy of this if you need to. We'll make sure Luis has one that he can share with you. Okay. But you can see it already has, if you can see the writing here, it's a little small, but see here, you will cross out each power withheld from this, I give them the power to, run my business, but not to do real estate transactions or something like that, or tax matters or something like that. Okay. All right, so other considerations, again, identify a person to run your business in your absence. This is if you want to keep your business, of course. You want to make sure that this person is, either named in your POA, just make sure that they are trusted and they don't have like an interest that's contrary to yours, like a family member who always thought that they wanted your business and thought, if they only had the chance. Yeah, no, that's not a good person for this. Um, do they own, oh, shoot. Oh, something happened here. Sorry, something jumped here, back here. Sorry. Here we go. Go back again.
And Bill, we have a quick question here from Carlos. He says, if I'm not California based, can this be modified for a different state?
Oh, yeah, if you're not California based, then we can probably connect you with another version of this in another state, because I know our other, sister organizations are doing these kinds of things in other states. So just why don't you tell Luis which state you're in, and we can probably link you up with another state. But by the way, most of this is federal, but I would say the selling of the business part, that's probably pretty state specific. Yeah, any of the immigration stuff would be, applicable in any state, but the selling of your business is a state focused issue. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So yeah, determine what's possible. Can you run your business online? Can you access your business bank accounts online? These are things that should go into your decision of whether you can continue to keep this going when you're potentially in another country, or whether you need a power of attorney for somebody to take it over. So checklist for keeping your business is that we suggest you form this legal entity, do the power of attorney so that you have somebody who can run it in your absence. Okay. Selling your business. Okay. Well, there's a few things to think about with this. First of all, I guess what I would do is, just like if you're selling something on Craigslist, or you're at a marketplace and somebody wants to buy something from you, first thing you have to think about is, well, what is it worth? What are you going to charge for this thing? Okay. So the way you do that with a business is think about assets of the business first. Okay. Think about, money in the bank, property. Does it have a vehicle? Does it have any things that are intangible? Like, for example, maybe you have a trademark that you registered with the US Trademark Office. Maybe you have a customer list. Okay, these are all assets that should be sort of on the table when you value the business. Okay, we're going to talk to you in a moment about how to value the business for a sale. Okay, so first, again, make a list of everything it owns, anything that has value. As I said, tangible would be easy to sell for cash. Inventory, for example. Intangible, yeah, this would be like the client list or a business plan, or something that doesn't readily, have a price tag on it. Okay. But we're going to tell you how to get that value in a minute. Okay. See, these are examples of these sorts of things. Okay. Goodwill of the business, I'll talk to you about in just a minute. That's kind of a elusive asset, but we'll tell you what to do with it. Okay, well then, as you might think, if you're an accountant or something, you think always of, okay, what are the assets of the organization? What are my liabilities? What do I sort of have to subtract from those assets to reach a kind of a balance? Okay. So liabilities would be outstanding obligations of the business. Maybe there's an outstanding bill that you owe, or maybe there's a lawsuit that's pending or something like that. There's a loan that you have to pay back. Okay, so these are things that you need to take into account when you are valuing the business. Potentially, you're deducting liabilities from assets to get your sort of final, list of the value of the business there. Okay. Now, what you can do is you don't actually have to get rid of all these liabilities before you sell the business. You just have to make sure they're accounted for in the sale, so that, potentially it lowers the price, so that then the person takes the business subject to these liabilities, you see. Okay. Organizing documents, yeah, of course. Buyers of any kind of business, want to see things like, how about a lease? Let's say they are buying your restaurant, you have a lease, they want to see what that is. They want to see that you have licenses, like liquor license, or food permits or stuff. If, of course, it's property owned by you, they'd want to see the deed and other documents that show that you own it and things. They're going to want to see some financials, profits, losses, balance sheets, cash flows, all of those different things, probably for the last 3 years. They probably want to see your tax filings. Okay. And, if you got a business plan, anything that, is a summary of what the business has been doing, they're going to want to see that sort of thing. This is what we call due diligence, meaning somebody looking to see, yeah, what is the real value? What are the liabilities? What are the things that I don't want to buy or I only want to buy if I'm this buyer of the business with knowledge that I'm buying it. Okay. All right, now here's the valuation. The valuation is kind of tricky because most people can't afford an actual appraiser to value the business because they take, a couple of $1,000 to do it. They're very good at it, but it does take some time for them to go through all the assets, all the liabilities, and then start thinking about, well, what are some comparable sales that have happened with other similar businesses? Because that can also affects the value of the business, you see. Now, there's three approaches to valuation if you don't hire somebody. Okay. This is kind of interesting. Okay, first you think about, okay, well, what is the income? So the income approach would be, okay, what was the income this past year? Was it likely to be in future years? Okay. And of course, you have to take into account that future dollars are worth less than, current dollars because of inflation and stuff. So an accountant could probably do this for you pretty easily, a bookkeeper. Um, then there's also this thing called an asset-driven approach. This is a little broader. It says, okay, not only what income you're going to be getting in the future, but what are your assets? What do you have in the bank now? What is the value of property that is tangible that we can value and things like that? Okay. But then there's also this thing, the market approach. And this usually what happens with a young business because, you know, um, it's really hard to figure out what would be the value of a roller rink that you're selling off. Okay, well, how would you figure that? Well, maybe the income, okay, maybe the fact that it's got all these assets, the skates and music and all that sort of stuff. But they would also probably want to look at, well, what are roller rinks going for in this geographic area? 5 years ago, there was a roller rink down, 5 miles away, and that was sold for X. Okay, why is that not informing the potential sale of it today with, counting for 5 years? So this is where comparables are an important part of your equation here. And, you can do your own comparables. You can say, well, our business is like, our restaurant is very much like this other restaurant. It's not anything like that restaurant over there. And this other restaurant was sold for X amount, uh, this is, the science of it. It's not an exact science in some way. Of course, an appraiser would give you a science answer. Okay. There are some online business valuation tools. I don't know very much about them, but okay. Now here's the idea of, let me see if I have on the next page something like this. No, no, okay. Here's that thing about goodwill. Okay. This is what it looks like. All right. So um, let's say you have a partnership to do an IT business. You're offering tech advice for computers and things like that. Okay. If you tried to sell that thing within the first year, probably what would make the most sense with that is to do either asset or income based because there's no track record for this. And you've probably not gotten known very well in the community yet after just 1 year. Okay. But if you take that same IT business and think of it 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you would say to yourself, well, it is more than just the assets and the income. It's got, regular sales. It's got word of mouth. It's got marketing that has happened just because, you're on a busy street corner or something like that. And so the idea is, what is the difference between that business that would be sold in the first year versus after 5 or 10 years? What's the difference between that? You take the assets, you take the income, you take all of the assets there, that 5 year or 10-year older business is going to sell for more than just your assets. Okay. The idea is somebody will look at it and say, hey, I think I could take this over with the same goodwill that the community has extended to it. It's worth more than just its assets. That's what goodwill is. Okay. But it's hard to figure. It's basically what will the market bear for something like that. Okay, one other thing about getting ready to sell the business is to review all your contracts because the buyers are going to want to see these too. As I said, leases, customer contracts, supplier contracts, um, yeah, technology licenses that you have, um, anything, employment agreements, all of these are going to be, reviewed by somebody who wants to buy these things. And of course, you don't want unwritten contracts, handshake deals, only deals that are agreements reflected in text messages. Yeah, these are things that aren't solid enough really to be bought and sold. Okay. And again, we can help you with these things as well. Um, when you're looking at your contracts, a few things to pay attention to for this. Yeah, term and termination. That's going to be important because, yeah, let's say somebody wants to buy your restaurant. Well, if the term for the restaurant's lease is only, 3 months more after the sale, then they could be in trouble, at that point. The landlord doesn't want to renew the lease. Yeah, they're going to want to see that lease, and see when it is terminating. Yeah, or how they could terminate the lease. The flexibility of the assignment. So here's one thing. Yeah, it could be that something, a lease agreement, for example, could be assigned. It could be the tenant has the right to assign a lease with the landlord's consent, something like that. So you would want to look for something like that. Change of control. Sometimes an agreement, it'll say what happens if there's a change of control, meaning somebody buys the business. Maybe it means the employment contract continues, for example, or it means the employment contract ends automatically, things like that. Okay. Limitations on liability. These are pretty straightforward, I guess. Indemnity, this would be, yeah, if there's any unresolved damages or stuff after the sale, it may be that the buyer has to indemnify the seller or the other way around, things like that. All right, so stages of selling this business. You probably will have an initial offer. Okay, you say to somebody, I'm thinking of buying and selling my business. You'll probably get an initial offer in a letter or something. It's sometimes called a letter of intent. And it would be, hey, I'm thinking I would like to buy your business. Let's get together and talk terms. Might even have an offer right up at the front, I'll buy it for $200,000, something like that. Okay. Usually it includes price. Usually it'll say, paid in cash or something like this, or maybe it'll have some conditions like conditioned on financing, getting financing for it, things like that. Okay. Then there's due diligence. That's that period I was talking about where essentially the attorneys or the buyer for the attorney for the buyers will be looking it up and down and saying, okay, gee, we've got these obligations, we've got these contracts, we've got, potential risks and stuff. And then that'll go back to the buyer and seller and they will negotiate those things. And then finally, there will be an offer from the buyer, a final offer based on the due diligence. Then there would tend to be a drafting and signing of the purchase agreement, and then a setting of a closing date by which everybody has the financing or all the disclosures done by a certain date, and then usually the escrow agent who is taking from both sides and withholding like a deed or something like that, when the seller puts in their money and seller puts in their the deed and all the disclosures that are being asked for, and then the buyer puts in their money. And once the escrow agent looks it all over and makes sure everybody is complied, then they, cause the contract to be signed by everybody and the deed is, or whatever the proof of ownership is passed. Right? Okay, let's see. I think I covered this pretty much. Purchase agreement then will, have a price, have the legal steps required to make it official. Reps and warranties are a pretty important thing. That means that, for example, the seller is saying, look, this business is in good shape, no outstanding debts, things like that. This is the way that, what some people say to me who buy businesses is they say, what you probably want to do is have a little bit of money held back by the buyer if you're a buyer. meaning that, within a year, you're going to be paying another payment for the business or something like that. And that's so that if the reps and warranties fall apart, somebody goes, oh, yes, there was a plumbing problem or something like that, then you can withhold money to pay for that. You don't have to go after them in court to enforce it. You see. There's, of course, in the purchase agreement, guidelines about who gets the regulatory approvals, how do you transfer the liquor license, things like that. And then this timeline for when all of the disclosures and documents are going to be signed and ready. Okay. Now, here's a very important distinction. Okay. You can buy a business as an asset sale or as an equity sale. Okay. What am I talking about here? If you had a restaurant, okay, and you think it's going really well, and it's doesn't have a lot of obligations, doesn't have a lot of, bad things that you find when you're doing due diligence, maybe a few outstanding little things that have to be paid here or there. Well, in that situation, maybe you want to do an equity sale. That means you're buying the entire business, everything in the business, and its obligations. Okay. So this might mean that yeah, if there's a little outstanding lawsuit, you don't think it's very, gonna amount to very much. Yeah, you buy the business subject to that lawsuit. Yeah. That would be an equity sale. Whereas instead, if you think this restaurant has a lot of sort of bones that are good in the business, but you don't want to take on these extra obligations, then maybe what you're really doing is just buying the assets of the business. You're buying the fryer, you're buying the chairs, you're buying maybe the name of it. But these, client lists or something like that. But you're just basically doing shopping with a shopping list and saying, I'm buying these things, but I'm not buying the whole thing, you see. So this is a choice that you're going to have to make when you are thinking about buying a business. And of course, when you're thinking of selling a business, you probably want to walk away with an equity sale if you can do that. So you would settle things that then, the buyer would say, okay, well, there's not enough left for me to worry about in terms of these outstanding obligations. I'll just buy the whole thing. That's usually better for you as a seller. Of course, notify the state of California. Department of Tax and Fee Administration has to know about the sales. You have to check some local requirements about sales. There might be some taxes there. If you have a sale business that involves land, a sale of land, then you also have to go to the Board of Equalization. You also have to usually involve the court where all the records are kept, things like that. I don't mean a court. You don't have to go through court. It's just saying that's where the records are usually kept or at the county. Okay. So checklist, selling your business, value it, identify those assets and liabilities, organize all the documents for the seller or for the buyer, try to perform a valuation on your own or buy some, purchase the services of an appraiser. Review your contracts. Once you find the buyer, then you do some negotiation and then, hopefully it goes through, decide whether it's going to be an asset or an equity sale, and then notify the state of California. Okay. Taxes and then County Board of Equalization. Okay, how do you close a business? Okay, this is pretty straightforward. Okay, there's two government requirements to think about. The Franchise Tax Board and the IRS, basically the taxing authorities, and then the Secretary of State for California that oversees the creation and the dissolution of businesses. Okay, and they work together. Actually, you got to think about this. So here's an important point. The Franchise Tax Board will not let you close without paying off all of your taxes that are due. Okay, so if you have not paid them their franchise tax, if you have not paid income tax, they will say, look, you have to keep going until, we get a final resolution and a full payment from you. And so this is why a number of people will walk away from their LLCs or their corporations and just leave the franchise tax bills continuing to be levied every year because it's so expensive to pay them all off in order to dissolve. Now, the next question you're probably asking is, well, wait a minute, if it's mounting up, isn't it possible that they'll go after me personally in this situation? Well, here's what the Franchise Tax Board says every time we ask about that. They say, we have never gone after anybody personally. We treat this as the business's expense, not the person's owner's issue or issue to resolve. Now, of course, if you as an owner took income from the business, then that's your personal liability there for paying taxes on the income. But as to the franchise taxes, that is only levied for you to, pay for that limited liability protection. That is seen as an expense of the business, okay? And what they've said is, we've never in history had the state of California be in such bad financial shape that they have to go after this, but they always reserve the right to do it if the state needs it. I'm, from what they've said, it's just not something that I think you have to worry about. Okay. So they'll send you this notice every year. You owe these taxes, you owe these taxes. Oh, here's another franchise tax on top of that from last year, and then that. That's going to continue and it'll be a bother, but not only can you sort of say, okay, that's an obligation of the business, but here's an interesting thing. You can open another one. Okay, and a number of people do this. They just open another one. I might suggest that you use a different address if you can. I've never seen them connect to businesses. I had somebody who opened two other businesses LLCs that he walked away from, and then he still got a third one, that he's still using today. So what I'm saying is better to give them different information, make it look different, don't use the same name. But generally, racking up franchise tax costs year by year by year because you couldn't dissolve the thing isn't something that's probably going to come back to haunt you. Okay. The franchise tax board would say never say never. Okay. All right. Now here's the thing. The thing you want to pay attention to in particular are two things. One is that the Franchise Tax Board and the IRS require you to cease business transactions, business operations when you are dissolving the thing. Okay. The Secretary of State would say, make sure you do that and file for dissolution before the end of the calendar year. Why? Because if you tip over into the next calendar year, they're going to levy another franchise tax payment on you. Okay. So make sure that you dissolve before the end of the year. Okay. Now, you don't have to put in your tax return right at that time. Again, dissolve before the end of the year, stop doing business using that entity before the end of the year. Now, you then get the chance to do your tax return. Tax return then goes in whenever all your taxes are due anyway. But you want to write up in the upper right-hand corner, final return for both your federal and your state return. Okay, so that way they will pay attention and they will say, oh, okay, we're not expecting income from this entity next year. Okay. All right. That's what you do with Franchise Tax Board, IRS, and the Secretary of State. All right. There are some forms. Oh, here's a nice little overview of how you do it on the Franchise Tax Board. So just put in closing a California business entity and pull up the Franchise Tax Board. It'll tell everything you need to do. There's certain forms to do with the Secretary of State. Usually you have to dissolve and have a vote of your board if you're a corporation, or you have a vote of your membership if you're an LLC. The form will tell you how much you have to have, if it has to be unanimous or if it can be less than unanimous. Okay. Finally, here's that link for the Franchise Tax Board, and then also here's an overview of the Small Business Advocate's Office that gives you a little overview there. Okay. All right, so as I said, make sure you do the Secretary of State requirements before the end of the year, stop doing business, put in your dissolution form, and then complete the IRS and Franchise Tax Board tax returns, final tax return, put final at the top. Just do that when you're supposed to file your returns. All right, main overview, make a plan, know your rights, make sure you have an immigration attorney, either, identified or meet with them to get extra information. Those are the main things we want to convey to you going forward. So, okay, everybody,